Force and pressure. Questions only. What do we experience in our everyday life? Why is it important to learn about different kinds of force? Why should we become aware of the effects of force such as friction, gravity, and magnetic force? What powers everything on Earth? What kinds of actions act on our bodies and the things around us? Can you identify the type of force being applied in a given situation? Is it a pull or a push? Can force also stop things from moving? What must be done to get something to move? What do we do with the rope in a game of tug of war? What action is performed with a thumb pin on a board? What do we do to a shopping cart while moving through a grocery store? How can most daily actions be grouped? What does every push or pull exerted result in? What is force? What actions require force to be exerted? In which activities is force used? What are some examples of force being used in daily life? Why is force needed in activities like lifting, turning, and pushing? Can more than one force act on an object at the same time? What different forces are needed to ride a bicycle? What do our feet do to the pedals while riding a bicycle? What do our hands do to the handlebars and brakes? How do our muscles help while riding a bicycle? What do the tires of a bicycle push against? What does the ground do in response to the tires? What is one characteristic of force related to interaction? What happens to a football placed on the ground at the start of a match? When will the football move? Why is interaction between objects necessary for force? What is required for a force to come into play? What results in a push or pull upon an object? Can living and non-living things apply force on another object? What is one common misconception about force? What is the definition of force in relation to objects? What is meant by magnitude of force? What happens when football players kick a ball? When is more strength used while kicking a football? When is less strength used while passing the ball? How is the strength of a force usually expressed? What happens to the football when force is applied in a certain direction? What is required to change the direction of a moving ball? What are two key characteristics of force? What happens when two equal forces push in opposite directions? What are balanced forces? What happens when two people push a box with equal force in opposite directions? Why does the box not move in the case of balanced forces? What is the resultant force when forces are balanced? What happens when two forces are not equal in strength? What are unbalanced forces? What happens when one person pushes a box harder than another in the opposite direction? Why do unbalanced forces cause movement? What is a spring balance or Newton's balance? What are the components of a Newton's balance? What happens to the spring when force is applied in Newton's balance? What does the pointer measure in a spring balance? What does the reading on the scale of a spring balance indicate? Force and its effects. Questions only. What happens if you and your friend both push in the same direction? What happens if two forces act in opposite directions? What happens if two forces act in the same direction? How can we define force based on motion? Is opening a refrigerator door a push or a pull? Is crushing a can a push or a pull? Is lifting a suitcase a push or a pull? Is pressing a light switch a push or a pull? Which of these activities indicates one object applying force on another? Which two objects must interact to lift a heavy bucket? Can we see force directly? What are the two general effects of force? What is the C unit of force? Who is the Newton unit named after? What are the two states of motion of an object? What is the state of rest? What is meant by change in state of motion? How does force make a stationary object move? How does force change the speed of a moving object? How does force change the direction of a moving object? How does force make a moving object stop? Can force change the shape and size of an object? How does a potter use force to shape clay? Person A pushes a box with a certain force and person B helps by pushing in the same direction. How does it affect the box? You pick up a few books lying on a table and put them in your bag. How does it affect the books? Force and shape change. What happens when Anu blows air into a balloon? What effect of force will be seen on the balloon when Anu pushes it with both hands? Types of forces. What are the two main types of forces? What are contact forces? What is muscular force? In which daily activities is muscular force used? What is frictional force? What causes a rolling ball to stop on the ground? Where does friction occur? On what does the amount of friction depend? Which surface has more friction? Rough or smooth? What is an example of frictional force on a smooth surface? What is an example of frictional force on a rough surface? Non-contact forces. What are non-contact forces? What is gravitational force? What happens when you jump up in the air? What is the force that pulls all objects towards the earth called? Is gravity only a property of the earth? What force keeps planets in their orbits? What are examples of gravitational force in daily life? What is electrostatic force? What happens when you rub a balloon on your hair? What causes your hair to stand towards the balloon? What are some examples of electrostatic force in daily life? In the plastic ruler experiment, why does the ruler on the bottle rotate away? What is magnetic force? Contact and non-contact force identification. Which of these is an example of contact force? Which of these is an example of non-contact force? At a birthday party, kids rubbed balloons on their sweaters and stuck them to the wall. Which force caused this? Why do you think that particular force caused the balloons to stick? Pressure. What is pressure? What happens when you press a sharp pencil between your fingers? Why do you feel more pain on the finger pressing the pointed end of a pencil? What does the effect of force on a surface depend on? What happens when force is spread over a smaller area? What happens when force is spread over a larger area? How is pressure defined? What are some real-life examples where pressure is important? Pressure, force, and area. Questions only. What is the mathematical relationship between pressure, force, and area? What is the formula to calculate pressure? What happens to pressure when the area decreases while force remains constant? What happens to pressure when the area increases while force remains constant? What is the C unit of pressure? 1 Pascal is equal to how much force per unit area? Who is the unit Pascal named after? Practical applications of pressure. Questions only. Why do we wear snowshoes instead of high-heeled boots on snow? Why do tractors and machines that move on soft ground have wide tires? Why do camels and elephants have broad feet? Why do bags and suitcases have broad straps and handles? Why does a sharp knife cut better than a blunt knife? Why do athletes wear shoes with spikes? Why do tools like spades have sharp and thin edges? Why do nails and needles have sharp tips? Liquid pressure. Questions only. Do liquids exert pressure? What happens when an object is immersed in a liquid? What determines whether an object floats or sinks in a liquid? What happens to liquid pressure as depth increases? What is the effect of water pressure on the walls of a container? Why are dams built stronger and thicker at the bottom? Why do deep-sea divers wear special suits? What do liquids exert at the same depth? Pressure in fluids. Questions only. On what does the pressure of a fluid depend? Will the pressure be the same at the bottom of a wide shallow cylinder and a tall narrow cylinder? If both contain the same volume of water, in two identical cylinders with different amounts of water, where will the pressure at the bottom be greater? What does a taller column of liquid do to the pressure at the bottom? Pressure in gases. Questions only. Do gases exert pressure? Why does a bicycle ride feel smoother when the tires are filled with air? What happens to the ride when air is removed from the tires? Why does a metal can get crushed when inverted into cold water after boiling water inside it? What happens to the pressure inside the can when the steam condenses? What causes a balloon to burst when too much air is blown into it? What causes gas pressure in a closed container? What happens to the pressure of a gas when it is heated? Why does pressure increase when more air is pumped into a balloon? Atmospheric pressure. Questions only. What is the atmosphere? What is atmospheric pressure? Why do we not feel the pressure exerted by the atmosphere? What causes your ears to pop during airplane takeoff and landing? Is atmospheric pressure the same at all places on Earth? How does altitude affect atmospheric pressure? What instrument is used to measure atmospheric pressure? How does a mercury barometer work? What is the modern instrument used to measure air pressure? Who uses barometers to make forecasts and study weather? What kind of weather is usually associated with low pressure areas? What kind of weather is usually associated with high pressure areas? Practical applications of atmospheric pressure questions. Why is artificial pressure maintained inside an aircraft cabin during flight? Why do our ears pop during takeoff or landing in an airplane? How does a straw work when we drink a liquid using it? How does a syringe draw in medicine from a bottle? How does a dropper fill with liquid when its bulb is released? Pressure calculations questions. A knife is used to cut a vegetable. How much pressure would be exerted by the knife if a force of 10 newtons is exerted on an area of 0.5 square meters? A potter carried a box on a round cloth of area 200 square centimeters over his head. The pressure exerted by the box was 0.25 newtons per square centimeter. What was the force exerted? Liquid pressure direction questions. During Holi, Anu noticed her water balloons looked bigger at the bottom than at the top. What does this show about liquid pressure? Experimental understanding questions. What do you predict will happen if a glass filled with water and covered with cardboard is turned upside down? Why does the cardboard stay in place when the glass is full of water and turned upside down? What scientific principle does this experiment demonstrate?